Thank you so much, Angela, for joining us. Such an honor to be able to chat to you, and really appreciating and learning a lot from your work. I'm not a migraine sufferer, but I know so many friends and family that have benefited massively from your knowledge and your expertise. So I'm joined today by Angela A Stanton PhD. She talks about the treatments of migraines in her lecture in our new upcoming neurology module for the Nutrition Network. Angela is a migraine and nutrition scientist and a long-term migraine sufferer herself, and was fed up with the lack of understanding and treatments for migraines within the medical community. So she focused her research on the root cause of migraines as well as their prevention and treatment. Her research has helped her identify a migraine code, or a collection of circumstances that likely cause migraines, which is explained in her book, Fighting the Migraine Epidemic, How to Treat and Prevent Migraines Without Medicine. And she helps migraine sufferers, I know, all over the world, and certainly in the low-carb community, immensely. So, Angela, thank you so much for your time today, or this evening where you are. Tell me about your own journey with migraines. Let's start there, and how you got into this work.
Sure. Thank you for asking me, and thank you for this interview. And it is midnight here, so forgive for the light. It's kind of dark here. So my journey, I actually started migraines when I was about 10, maybe 12 years old. I don't really know how young, and I have no one to ask, but they were atypical. So they were cyclical vomiting syndrome and other kind of symptoms, which nobody at that time anyway associated with, I guess you say migraine, for I say migraine. So no one associated that with migraine at that time. And I didn't realize I had migraines until I was almost 30, like the late 20s is when I realized that what I had were migraines. And that was the time when I started to get headaches. And then they got worse and worse and worse. Of course, you don't need to have headaches with migraines. So I was lucky in some ways that I had headaches, so I could figure out what it was. And then it started to get really bad. And as I got to be older, by the time I reached in my middle age, like 45, 50, it was like daily. And when I started my research, I didn't have a day without migraine.
Wow. So tell me about the difference between a migraine and a headache, just for the understand, because I don't, as I said, I don't think I've ever had migraines, but I've certainly had headaches. So what is the difference, feeling and physiologically?
So that's a very good question. It's a long question. So just to be very short in that, first of all, migraine is a genetic condition. So you can't have it unless you have the genes to have a migraine for it. And so we refer to that as migraine brain, because it's basically a genetic modification in your brain. So a headache, you can have a headache for anything. You don't need to have a special migraine brain. But if you have a migraine brain, then you may not even have a headache. So it's not a headache. We all seem to think that migraine comes with a headache. And I had people tell me that, I had such a big headache, like a migraine, because people saying that the migraine is a really bad headache. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the other symptoms that come with migraine. Like migraineurs will vomit, for example. They will get dizzy. They may have vertigo. They may have aura. They may appear like you have a stroke, like they may not be able to use half of their face. They may slur. I was watching a news one day, and the newscaster had a migraine, and she was saying words that absolutely made no sense, but she had no idea. So they thought she had a stroke, but she actually just had a migraine. So a migraine is really a condition that's not even similar to a headache. You don't need to have a headache, and if you do, you do, but it's just that too is different because it's going to be only on one side, and it's never going to be throbbing. It's going to be a non-stop, and by definition, based on the Headache Society, a migraine is minimum 4 hours. So if you have a headache less than 4 hours, it's not a migraine. And a migraine can go on for days. Most migraineurs I talk to typically have a 3-day pain period. And then you have a prodrome, which is usually a day or a few hours before the migraine. It can go up to 2 days, having sort of like you may be very hyper, or maybe you're pissed at the world, or maybe your stomach is kind of weird or funny. And so you get sort of prodromes. It's like precursors to the migraine. So if you recognize them, you can prevent your migraine at this time. And then you also have a post-drome, which will follow a migraine and which will make you feel very tired. You just kind of beat. You forget things. It's really foggy. So a headache will also respond to over-the-counter medications, often even a cup of coffee. A migraine will not respond to any over-the-counter medication at all.
Okay, so very debilitating and a
Yes.
massive setback. I know this for certain family members that suffer with migraines. It's like days, if not a week off, out of the office, suffering, unable to function in daily life, which sounds like something that you had from quite a young age.
Right. I have some migrants I work with who are just like 1 year old. And of course, I'm not working with them, I'm working with their parents. But I read a couple of articles that suggested that babies who are colicky, the colic actually is a representation of a migraine. So it can start at a very early age, and it can go. I work with people who are past their 90s. So it's all through your life, and it changes as well. Like for men, they may outgrow it because the hormones change and their responses change. And so they may just have migraine through their puberty and then suddenly no more. So there could be a host of variabilities in this.
So obviously you were driven by very personal and important reasons to get into the research that you did.
Right.
How did you find the application that you now use? And tell us about how you treat migraines.
Okay, so I was the guinea pig of experimental lab as per Angela Stanton. That's basically what it was, because I was desperate. I mean, most migrants I talked to who join me in my Facebook group or read my book or just contact me by email and send me a note, tell me that they're desperate. Migrants just tell me they're suicidal. They're ready to kill themselves because nothing is working. And so you reach a point where you say, well, I got to try something, whatever it is. If they tell me to eat my shoes, I will eat my shoes. Just let's get to the bottom of this. So I reached that point where nothing was helping. Doctors couldn't help me. Medications weren't working. Nothing was working. And you reach a point, well, it's just not worth it. So I got to do something. And so rather than trying to commit suicide, which many people actually do, I decided to look into the science because I happen to be a scientist. I said, okay, well, here's a connection. I have the right to get articles free of charge because I have memberships at 3 universities. So I was able to access all the articles. I was able to read books. I was able to attend conferences. I was able to participate and talk to other scientists. And I was able to understand the very different fields. I mean, I was reading fields in genetics, fields in physiology, endocrinology, anatomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics. And I'm a mathematician, so that also helped me to understand the mathematics and the physics behind it all, because believe it or not, there was a lot of physics involved. And I found a lot of information in physics journals, which had nothing to do with migraine, but it allowed me to understand the connections of how the brain worked and how atoms and electrons worked and how they participated in the operation of the cell, which then allowed me to sort of connect the dots. I said, so this is what genetics tells me, and this is what it means in chemistry and in physics and in mathematics. And then I could say, okay, so how does it connect to something I can touch or do? And then slowly it occurred to me that there's a lot of connection to the food that we eat. Obviously, everything we are is our food, right? So it sort of kind of started to sink in that it's got to be something that I eat or do or drink or something like that. And so I started to experiment with myself, initially just trying everything, like adding magnesium, adding vitamins, adding this, adding salt, adding whatever. I was adding a whole lot of things and see if they worked or if they didn't work. And then suddenly the salt popped in and it worked. I said, whoa, this is working. I don't have a migraine now. What did I just do? And then I kept repeating. And then my mother was still alive, and we had a person coming in to help her every day to take a shower and to get ready. And she would see me pop salt and she would just laugh her head off. And she herself was a migraineur too. And she said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm taking salt because this is working for my migraine. It's helping me prevent my migraines. So she started doing it. And she too had her migraines disappear. And so it sort of kind of grew out of this.
Mm. So talk to me about the diet that you were on and how you changed it. Obviously, you've mentioned salt, which is an important one that I would like to get into a bit more detail. But what did you do? What did you change? What worked for you?
Okay, so at the beginning, the only thing I changed was salt. I just added salt. And what I did was, because I don't like the taste of salt, and I said, okay, first thing in the morning, I will take a pinch of salt. It's tolerable. And I will drink some water after that, and I will be fine. And because at that time, I turned lucky, because if you take salt at different times of the day for different kind of food in response with water, that could actually make it worse. But I didn't know that. But when you take it first thing in the morning, and I took it with water and I had nothing yet in my stomach, I was fine. And so this happened to be a completely lucky coincidence that I didn't have any food in my stomach yet, because if I had eaten carbohydrates before that, the water would have increased my migraine. And I would never have known that it was because of the water. I mean, I eventually may have known, but it would have delayed the time to research. So it was quite serendipitous to get to the point of not yet understanding what I was doing and why I was doing it, but I was doing it. And I also have to say that salt itself is an emetic, so it's going to make you vomit. You can use salt to vomit. And so at one point I started to literally like gag on it. I said, why am I doing this? And I looked it up. And so then the next thing that I was doing is to switch to taking the salt pill form. And then that was working. And then the salt pill was in a certain size. And so I started to play with the salt pill sizes. And then I sort of kind of figured out what size of salt was good for me for preventing things. And then I would get a migraine, say in the afternoon, because I would eat a slice of bread or a sweet potato or something. And then I said, well, what would happen if I took another salt? And then I would try it. And then it would be working. And so I was sort of kind of ahead of my game. So I did my experiment first, and then I went to see if it made any sense in terms of science. And so some of the things that I did didn't make any sense, but the salt always did. And so I needed to understand what that was and sort of kind of reworked, like a reverse engineering of what I did and why it may have worked.
Incredible. Wow. So I mean, it's obviously so contradictory, and we now know that sodium is underestimated as an important part of the diet that's been excluded heavily by so many large parts of the population because of the association with high blood pressure. So are you seeing that with your patients? I mean, what is the association between migraine and low sodium?
Okay, so this is the part that is very complicated. So basically, if you look at migraine and if you look at the genetics of migraine and the physiology of migraine, the migraine itself, I mentioned earlier the migraine brain. So migraine brain means that certain genes are variant, so they mutated. And the question is whether they really truly are mutated or all humans were this way at one time. And there's an evolutionary path to this that I have sort of kind of created, which tells me that all humans are likely this way. And then the ones who can't tolerate carbohydrates are the variants that changed. So they adapted. So probably we are the more ancient brain in that regard. And so our brain is unable to handle glucose because glucose has a quality that when glucose enters the cell, any cell, it's going to displace water. And thereby it's going to displace sodium because where there's water, there's also sodium. So there's an electrolyte imbalance that glucose is going to create. And when I looked at the brain and how the brain functions, then I know that the brain functions by creating voltage in order to communicate because of the method by which the brain cells communicate. And if I eat glucose and if I interrupt my electrolyte, then I'm removing the very element that can create the voltage because it is sodium that is creating the voltage. And so this was a very big jump. And the other jump that came to this, which explained to me the sodium connection, is migraineurs have certain sensitivities, like we're very sensitive to light, to odors, to sounds. And then when I look at the literature, it tells me that migraineurs have a lot more connections between the brain cells of the sensory organs. So migraineurs have more connections between the sensory neurons associated with the nose and the eyes and the ears and the taste as well, and also the touch. And so with more connections, there's more chatter, so there's more voltage being created between the cells. And if there's more voltage being created, then migraineurs actually use more of salt and more of potassium and more of magnesium and more of calcium. And so more of all of the electrolytes, including water. And then when we eat glucose, what are we doing? We displace all of these because the glucose entered.
Exactly.
And so it's sort of kind of connected then that, okay, so there is something to do with the carbohydrates that we're eating. And once I started to cut carbohydrates from my diet, then I discovered I didn't have the prodromes, which I mentioned earlier, which were the precursors to migraine. I didn't have them like that anymore. And I wasn't so sensitive to pressure changes or temperature changes or other women who still menstruate. I'm too old for that, but they weren't sensitive to the menstrual changes. Suddenly the effect of full moon disappeared. And so changes happened as a result of removing my carbohydrates. So the genetic condition is that migraineurs, because of their brain, changes in the variants in the brain are actually referred to as channelopathy, which is basically an equivalent statement to saying that the ionic channels work differently. And so in a migraine brain, they do work differently. They work more often. We have more of them. And we need more electrolytes to operate them. And as a result of this, we're actually carbohydrate intolerant, not because it is causing us diabetes or other kind of heart issues, but because our brain is being stubbed by eating carbohydrates.
So did you find once you'd reduced your carbohydrates in your diet that you didn't need to take as much of the other minerals, in particular sodium? Or do
yes and no. It was kind of dependent upon the person. So I actually found that because once I reduced my carbohydrates in my diet, I ended up being more active. And so because I suddenly became, I could go to the gym and exercise, I could go and participate in life, and I could have a family life. I mean, I had children. I have no memory of them growing up. And now my older one is turning 40. And here I am, missed 39 years out of his, or 30 some years out of his life. And so when you become more active and you do more things, and I was reading a lot of books and studying and working with, and now I'm working with tens of thousands of people. And so it didn't reduce my need for salt because I became more active.
Amazing. So a question is, so it's on, in particular with your patients that don't want to follow a low carbohydrate diet, do they have to stick to it for life to reverse their migraines, or is it something that's a temporary adaptation and then they can go back?
Okay, so yes and no. There's two answers to this. So it depends on the person also. It depends on how long they have been migraineurs and how long it took them to reverse their conditions. So I'm working with some people who were vegan, for example, for life or 20 or 30 years. They will have a harder time to reverse their metabolic conditions that predisposes them to get the migraines. And so they will have to be on a special diet for life. They may be able to every now and then have a party and cheat and not suffer the consequences, but they may not. So we don't know. But those who had migraine for a very short time, or they were taking fewer medications, they have less brain damage. And I hate to use the term brain damage because it really isn't damage of the brain, but because the brain doesn't get enough sodium or potassium or calcium or magnesium or water, there is going to be a reduction in the connections of the brain. And so what I find is that people, for example, women in particular, after their hormonal changes, they stop having migraine and they think it's a good thing. But actually what it means is that their brain started to reverse and they're beginning to lose their sensory connections. And so this is not a good thing. They're deteriorating, they're losing their brain ability. And so these people will be able to then switch eventually onto the regular diet with carbohydrates because they won't have the extra connections. So their migraine genes are switched off by the epigenetic forces of the hormonal changes and the fact that they've never had a chance to repair their brains. And then there's an interim group into which I also belong, where I can go out. Like my younger granddaughter had her birthday yesterday. She was turning 6. And so we all went out to have dinner. and she ate an ice cream, something that she didn't want to eat, the whipped cream on top. So I ate the whipped cream, and it has sugar in it. And that was fine, but I haven't had it for a year or 2 years actually, because of COVID, we haven't seen her. So I had no problems. I just had to take quite a bit of salt, and I had some prodrome after that, but I didn't have a migraine, and here I am completely well. So obviously I can time to time, but I don't think that I could do it every day. And I think that...
So you have like a moment where you, I'm not going to say cheat because it sounds like you really don't, where you have a slip up like that. Do you take more salt and you find that supports the balance?
Right. And then also we tell the migraineurs that if they want to cheat, which is human, we all can cheat, right? At least cheat smartly. So cheat with the kind of foods that if they have to take salt after that, they will retain some kind of a balance between the sodium and the potassium. So, for example, cheating with eating a slice of cake full of grains and full of vegetable and seed oils may not be a best choice. But cheating with eating a large piece of watermelon, by all means, it's full of potassium. And so all you have to do is take salt and you're going to be retaining your balance. You regain everything. And so it's just going to be maybe a few more hours of discomfort, and then you're going to be fine. So there are smart cheats and then there are stupid cheats. So it depends.
So what foods across the bar should migraineurs avoid?
Okay, so the most important to avoid is basically all heavy-duty carbohydrates. And this would include, of course, sugar, all starches without exception, legumes, grains. So these all really need to go. I'm also recommending to all my migraineurs to avoid the substitutes, the sweeteners that are zero calorie, because they spike insulin. And when insulin is spiked, then the liver releases glucose. And again, then creating the cycle of the glucose releasing and replacing and causing electrolyte imbalance. So all the foods that would spike insulin highly, I would recommend not to take. And I would recommend also to not take exogenous ketones, not to take a lot of vitamins. We don't need them. We should eat right, and not take a lot of vitamins, because they can also cause trouble, because our brain is genetically modified and we do have some nutrient problems in terms of absorption and ability, like the vitamin B12 and some others. It's very common in the population, but I would say that it's more common in migraineurs. And there are some comorbidities with migraine. And so the comorbidities, so far I have found 3 that are very typical. A very large percent of migraineurs have them, but in the general population, it's very minimal, very small, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which would be the hyperflexibility of the joints. So many migraineurs, including me, have a lot of our joints dislocated. I don't know if I even have a joint that I haven't dislocated yet. And there's also Raynaud's syndrome, in which we get our fingers turned white from cold. And there is also cold urticaria, where we get rashes from cold. So these are all comorbid with migraine. And so I recommend that to reduce these, we need to also reduce and remove vegetable and seed oils.
So you mentioned that you don't recommend exogenous ketones. Why is that?
Okay, so because migraineurs have a completely different genetic system, they also have very different metabolism. And what I found is that probably because migraineurs are coming from perhaps a tribe where carbohydrates were not commonly consumed, it seems that migraineurs tend to fall into ketosis naturally, very easily. Because our migraineurs are so different in terms of metabolism, I find that once a migraineur falls into ketosis, nothing is going to bring that migraineur out of ketosis. Yeah. And so when we are measuring the levels of ketones in a migraineur, then if they take MCT oil, it converts to ketones. So we can't tell, is it high ketones because a migraineur is now experiencing a problem of high ketones? Is it a starvation sign? Or is it a sign of high insulin? Because when insulin releases ketones back up, because at that time ketone use is turned down, but ketone making is still going on. And so, or is it because she just ate MCT oil? We can't tell. And so in order for us to be able to tell, we ask everybody to not take MCT oil supplements, but because it's so easy for them to create their own ketones, we don't even need it. It's not something that we need to take.
Oh, that's amazing. So do you advocate that your patients use glucometers and ketone monitors and actually know what their blood sugar and blood ketone levels are?
Right, I do. And I also have a special test, which is, I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph Kraft, who was an MD who created a test that was a 5-hour oral glucose tolerance test where he measured glucose and insulin, and then he would graph it, and he would have 4 or 5 categories of where people stand in terms of insulin resistance of type 2 diabetes. And so I modified this for migraine, and I'm using it as a 5-hour postprandial, so there's fasting and before eating, so pre-meal, and I don't have them eat glucose. Obviously, they eat a low-carb diet. They just let me know what they ate, and they sum up the macros and the grams, and I will note in what normal curve to use and assume for their blood glucose and blood ketones. And then every half an hour, postprandial, they check their blood glucose and blood ketone minimum for 5 hours. And it could be longer depending upon what the last reading is. They want them to have a little upward trend for the last measure. If it keeps on going down, they have to go to the crash and then exercise to bring up. Or if it goes really badly, then eat. Or if it turns up, fine, then do that. So we use this regularly. So every single migraineur does it to the point that we can see, okay, they safely can move to ketogenic diet, because no migraineur can move to the ketogenic diet without this test.
Really? Wow.
They start with a low carb, high fat, and then also carnivore is okay. And then once I see that the blood glucose is totally stable, the ketones are totally stable, and the two respond to each other the proper way, then I know that the insulin is also okay.
So it's almost like what you're saying is that actually a migraine is caused by, I'm not going to say insulin resistance, but it's caused by fluctuations of blood glucose.
It does. So it's associated with metabolic condition. And so I do call it glucose or sugar intolerance or sensitivity. So this is what officially type 2 diabetes is called, a glucose sensitivity. But I call migraine the same, because even though they may not have type 2 diabetes for the same reason as somebody else does, but they're so intolerant toward carbohydrates because they don't know what to do with the glucose, because it causes so much problem that then it causes a major disarray in the body, to the degree that so my migraineur is coming into the group. These days, we get approximately 20 to 30 people coming in a day, and they all have to run this test. And I would say that 99.9999999% of them come in and they show severe insulin resistance without any official diagnosis.
Wow.
So they don't have any of the outward sign of diabetes.
Yeah, it does seem to be. I've noticed that the people that I know that suffer from migraines aren't your typical kind of metabolic syndrome candidates. They're generally thin, very athletic, have a different profile, physiological profile. So are your colleagues, is medicine taking this treatment seriously for migraines? Is it the standard of care? How's that going?
No, the standard of care is medications. Everywhere is medications. I'm not saying that there are no doctors who support what I do. There are plenty of doctors who support what I do. Many of them are actually in my migraine group, and they send their patients to the migraine group, but they still oversee what they're doing. And there are, however, many who completely disregard it. But I have many of my migraineurs who, they're also supposed to get a blood test from the doctor. I have a long list of lab requests that I need. And many of the doctors actually write on the book, and many of them contact me later and ask questions. And so there is quite a bit of interest, but it's definitely not the standard of care.
So how do you see the difference? You talked about women and cyclical, different symptoms. How does a migraine treatment and the picture differ from men to women?
Okay, so for women, because of the monthly period, so it could be a monthly cycle, it could also be the time when the egg is ripening. So it's at different times. It could be twice a month. There are different hormonal surges, and these hormonal surges require a different level of energy from the body, from the output. And estrogen has a strong connection, for example, with glucose, and progesterone has a different connection with glucose. And so there will be different movements of glucose forces through the body this time. Men don't have this, but men, when they're still young, they will have, and this is where evolution kind of sort of connects, which is my story. So it's not an official story, but migraine is very strongly associated with a fight or flight. So being concerned about your health and your well-being in your life is a very important part of migraine, because our sensory organs are so strong. We can smell predators perhaps miles away, where other people just could smell right away. So we have very strong senses. And so if you consider women as hunters and gatherers from our evolutionary past, women would be very much up for being attacked, because they would be gathering and they would be down on the floor, ground, searching for tubers and so forth, whereas men with equipment and weapons are fighting and hunting. So if I were a lion and if I were to attack, I would not attack the man with the weapon. I would be attacking the child and the mother. And so the child, before puberty or during puberty, all through puberty, is still subject to being attacked, even in the men. But once the man is past puberty, it's considered to be an adult, it will join the male hunters. It's no longer subject to be attacked by a lion. So it's a different kind of environment. And again, so this is my story. This is just what I envision, that it would explain why a male in a younger age, when he's still dependent upon being with the mother, would be as sensitized to the world around him as the mother is.
So, and you talked about the moon cycles and an association to migraines.
Right. And so the moon cycle would be very similar too, because if you look at the full moon, it's not that the moon does anything, like a lot of people saying that because it also brings the oceans, and brings the tides, that maybe it changes the fluid mechanics and dynamics in the brain. It doesn't, because we just have too little and it's a closed area, whereas, it's a different system. But what actually is happening is that during full moon, there's a much brighter light. And so we are more open to being attacked by predators even at night, whereas a moonless night is safer. We can hide easier. Then all predators just move really by scent. And so that's something that can be easier masked, perhaps. And so the moonlight itself, it's a bright light, is probably associated with an easier target. So we have become an easier target. So we have to be more alert to predators. And so I find that nearly all migraineurs are very sensitive to moon, but I find also that once they get on the higher salt and the low carbohydrate, that's the first thing that disappears.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's so fascinating. Wow, thank you for sharing that. I wasn't aware of that. So there's more of a tendency to have migraines at full moon than there is at new moon, for example.
Right, and so be prepared for that. And so we need to have more salt for the moon, because we will have a lot more chatter in our brain about the bright light. And so we can prevent all associated migraines with the full moon.
Unbelievable. Wow, that is something I did not know. Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So I had my last question was around your diet when you were a child, because obviously you must have, when you were 10, that is quite an interesting age, quite young to start seeing those symptoms, I would imagine, especially back then. Now it might be a bit different. What were you eating then, and what was your diet like as a child?
Okay, so I actually grew up very uniquely, because I grew up in another country. I grew up in Hungary, which at the time was behind the Iron Curtain. So we didn't have a lot of options for what to eat. We were not connected to Europe for exchange and trade. And when I was a child, many, many years ago, I hate to say this, we didn't have a refrigerator, because it just didn't exist yet at that time back in Hungary. So we had an ice box, and like a man would come once a week with a big block of ice, and then we would store it. And so at those years, and we're talking about 1950s, 1960s is when I grew up, There were no vegetable oils, seed oils, no cereals, none of that in my country, no processed foods, no canned foods. I mean, very minimal. I don't even recall having to open a can, to be honest. And we didn't have fruits and vegetables all through the year. We had them very seasonally. And we didn't use sugar. I don't recall having sugar at home. We had some sugar cubes for my mother who drank coffee, but we didn't actually have sugar per se. And we didn't have any sweets. And in fact, when I grew up, ice cream, for example, was only available in the summer. You couldn't get ice cream in the winter. It just didn't exist. And so we didn't really have what I would refer to as a SAD, standard American diet. We didn't have that. So most of my childhood was spent in what I would pretty much call a nearly ketogenic diet, because we ate a lot of pork fat. We ate a lot of bone marrow. These were very Germanish and Hungarian foods. We ate a lot of meat, and we ate a lot of fat. I mean, we had the bacon was not cooked. It was just smoked, and it was 99% fat and maybe a little meat on the outside. But most of our food was like that. And we did eat some beans and some rice. These were staples, but we didn't eat that much. And we didn't really eat that much bread. We drank a lot of dairy and cheese. But then also I had a family side that lived in France. And so I spent a lot of my summers in France and the south of France. So, and also in Paris. And so I also ate what I would call pretty close to what was the original Mediterranean diet. That was not what we call the Mediterranean. So the original Mediterranean was a lot of fatty fish, a lot of seafood, a lot of lamb, pork, like the jambon, like the prosciutto and that kind of stuff. And for salad, I don't recall seeing a bowl of salad until I came to the United States.
Interesting. Wow.
It just didn't exist. So eating all these vegetables, I don't recall eating vegetables. It was just not even. And then when I went back from the United States, I went back to Paris a couple of times to visit my family. And I was invited to a family for dinner one day. And they start with the meat. And you have to eat the meat, as much meat as you want. There's no side dish. And after you finish the meat, they serve the vegetables if you still want to eat some. It was completely separate. So there was some, I don't know, asparagus or something that I could no longer eat. And then after that, they brought the cheese plate. And there was no dessert. There was cheese and wine. And there were some nuts. And I think there were some dried fruits to go with that. And that was the food. We didn't have bread. And none of that.
Really beautiful, healthy, balanced diet.
And so this is how basically, and every time, all my life that I spent a lot of time in France, I ate a lot of fish, a lot of oysters, and all kinds of seafood, and a lot of fresh fruits because it was in the summertime, but they were always small amounts. We never ate like a lot of fruits. And I have not seen a salad at all, and no cereal. It just didn't exist. So that's just a new invention. That was an American thing. So all through my childhood, basically, and I left when I was 21, so a long time ago, and all through until I was 21, I was eating this kind of diet. And then even when I returned, when I was maybe 28, 29, still they were eating that kind of diet. Today, if I return, they eat something totally different. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So beautiful. Angela, thank you so much. Please tell me how our viewers can find your work. Obviously, if someone sees this and they suffer from migraines and they haven't heard of you, how can they find you? How can they find out more?
Sure. So I have a lot of presence all over the place. They can find me, of course, on my Twitter. My handle there is @migrainebook. So that's probably the easiest. I have a website, a lot of contacts coming from the website, which is stantonmigraineprotocol.com. It's all one word, Stanton, like my name, Migraine Protocol. And then, of course, on Facebook, the main protocol Facebook group is called Migraine Sufferers. So I recommend everybody who wants to contact me and join the group, join that, not the keto group because they won't be allowed in. So go for migraine sufferers. They can also get a hold of me on my private Facebook, which is Angela Stanton. I think maybe Dr. Angela. I don't even remember what that is. Angela Stanton PhD, I think it is. And of course, LinkedIn, Angela Stanton PhD. And then they just Google my name, Angela A Stanton PhD. They're going to find a lot of my articles, my books, and all my contact info.
Fantastic. So for those of you watching that are interested in seeing more and watching Angela's lecture on our upcoming module, neurology, she's got an amazing talk on the module, and we cover a lot of other neurological associations to disease. It's an incredible, incredible topic. My mind is expanded by the conversations that I've been lucky enough to have this week. Thank you so much, Angela, for your time.